We have all experienced that fleeting sensation where you are sitting alone in a quiet room and you catch a sudden flicker of movement just off to the side. It is that split second where your brain signals that something shifted in the periphery, but when you whip your head around to catch it, there is absolutely nothing there. Most of us just shrug it off. We tell ourselves it was a trick of the light, a floater in our eye, or maybe just our tired mind playing tricks on us after a long day. We move on with our lives because the alternative is just too uncomfortable to consider. But for a man named Leo, that little smudge of darkness at the edge of his vision was not an optical illusion or a symptom of fatigue. It was the first stage of a predatory countdown that was happening inside his own home. He was about to discover that once you acknowledge the shadow in the corner of your eye, you are inadvertently giving it permission to step out of the blur and into your reality. I am always curious about the different places these stories end up reaching, so before we get into the strange events in Ohio, go ahead and let me know in the comments which city or town you are tuning in from today. In the winter of 2023, Leo was living in a quiet, modern suburban house just outside of Columbus, Ohio. Leo was 32 years old and worked as a successful freelance graphic designer. Because his job involved high-pressure deadlines and a lot of creative focus, Leo was a total night owl. He found that the hours between midnight and 4 a.m. were his most productive. The world was silent, his phone stopped buzzing, and he could lose himself in the glowing light of his dual monitor setup. He was a logical, grounded guy who did not believe in the supernatural. To Leo, everything had a rational explanation, usually rooted in physics or biology. The first incident happened on a Tuesday night around 2:15 a.m. Leo was deep into a complex branding project. His office illuminated only by the soft blue light of his screens and a small desk lamp. To his left, the office door stood slightly ajar, leading out into the pitch-black kitchen. As he reached for his coffee, he saw a tall, thin shape dart across that darkened doorway. It was incredibly fast, appearing like a dark smudge moving through the air, and it vanished into the kitchen before he could even blink. Leo paused, his hand hovering over his mug. He did not feel a surge of fear, just a mild confusion. He rubbed his eyes, thinking that staring at high-contrast graphics for 6 hours straight had finally caught up with him. He took a sip of his coffee, stretched his neck, and went right back to work. He figured it was just his peripheral vision lagging behind his eye movements. But about 20 minutes later, at 2:35 a.m., it happened again. This time, the movement was to his right, near the corner of his walk-in closet. It was the same tall, spindly silhouette, and this time it did not dart away. It seemed to linger for just a heartbeat longer than it should have. It did not look like a person in the traditional sense. It looked like a gap in the room, a vertical sliver of darkness that was significantly darker than the shadows around it. Leo turned his head sharply, staring directly at the spot. The closet door was shut. The corner was empty. He stood up and walked over to the spot, even running his hand along the wall. It was just cold drywall. He decided to do a full sweep of the house just to settle his nerves. He walked through every room, flipping on lights as he went. The front door was deadbolted, the windows were all locked from the inside, and there was no one in the guest room or the basement. He was completely alone. He told himself to stop being paranoid, chalked it up to a lack of sleep, and decided to call it a night. As the following weeks went by, however, the shadow did not go away. In fact, it became a constant, looming presence in his life. It was no longer just a late-night occurrence. He would be brushing his teeth at 7:30 a.m. and see it standing at the far end of the hallway. He would be cooking dinner and catch it huddled in the corner of the dining room. It was always in the periphery. Every time he tried to look at it directly, it would dissolve or slip behind a piece of furniture. Leo did what any sensible person would do. He went to see an eye doctor, convinced he had developed some kind of medical issue. The ophthalmologist ran a battery of tests, but told him his vision was perfect. He then saw a therapist, thinking he was suffering from a stress-induced hallucination, But even as he began to prioritize sleep and reduce his workload, the shadow remained. It felt as if the entity was tethered to his gaze, a dark passenger that was slowly becoming more defined with every passing day. The atmosphere in the house began to change. It was no longer just a visual nuisance. It started to feel like a physical weight. The air in his office would suddenly turn frigid, and he began to experience a persistent, prickly sensation on the back of his neck, as if someone were standing just inches behind him, staring at his spine with a hungry intensity. By the middle of December, the entity had moved closer. On the night of December 14th, at exactly 3:33 a.m., Leo was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and trying to force his racing mind to shut down. He was lying on his side, facing the wall, when he caught sight of the corner of the room in his peripheral vision. The shadow man was standing right there, next to his dresser, but this time, it was not a smudge or a flicker. It was solid. It was a silhouette of a man, standing at least 7 feet tall, with limbs that were far too long and fingers that tapered into sharp, needle-like points. Leo felt his heart drop into his stomach. He was too terrified to turn his head and look at it directly, fearing that a direct gaze would trigger an attack. He stayed perfectly still, watching the creature through the corner of his eye. The shadow began to move. It did not walk with a human gait. It drifted across the floor like a spill of black ink, sliding along the walls until it reached the foot of his bed. Leo could hear a low, mechanical hum vibrating through the mattress, a sound that felt like it was originating from inside his own ears. The creature slowly reached out a long, spindly arm, and as its finger touched the edge of the duvet, the temperature in the room plummeted so sharply that Leo could see his own breath misting in the air. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body locking up as he felt that unnatural coldness spreading through the mattress toward his feet. It was a dense, heavy chill that did not just touch his skin but seemed to sink into his very bones. He could hear the fabric of the duvet crinkling softly, a tiny, rhythmic sound that told him the needle-like fingers of the entity were actually gripping the bed. The mechanical hum grew louder, vibrating through his skull until his teeth began to ache. He lay there for what felt like hours, a prisoner of his own terror, until the first faint light of dawn began to gray the edges of his curtains. When he finally found the courage to sit up and flip the light switch at 6:15 a.m., the room was empty, but the evidence of the night was undeniable. At the foot of his bed, 2 deep, hand-shaped depressions were pressed into the heavy comforter. They were still freezing to the touch, and the white fabric was faintly discolored, as if it had been lightly singed by an invisible flame. Leo did not go to work that day. He sat at his kitchen table, staring into a cold cup of coffee, realizing that his logic was failing him. This was not a medical condition, this was a presence. He spent the next few days in a state of hyper-vigilance. He moved his desk so that his back was against a solid wall, and he kept every light in the house burning 24 hours a day. He thought that by eliminating the shadows, he could eliminate the threat, but he quickly learned that the shadow man did not need a lack of light to exist. He would be sitting in his brightly lit kitchen at noon and see that familiar smudge of darkness standing right next to the refrigerator. It was as if the entity had burned itself into the very fabric of his reality, a permanent glitch in his field of vision. The psychological toll was devastating. Leo stopped eating, his weight dropping rapidly as his anxiety reached a fever pitch. He began to research similar cases online, diving into obscure forums and archived accounts of people who had seen what they called watchers. One specific post caught his eye. It was written by a man who claimed that these entities do not just haunt a location, they haunt a person. The writer explained that the shadow man feeds on acknowledgement. Every time you check the corner, every time you whip your head around to see if it is still there, you are feeding it. You are giving it the energy it needs to become solid. Leo realized with a jolt of horror that he had been doing exactly that. He had been obsessed with it. He had been looking for it in every corner at every hour of the day. he decided right then that he would stop. He would practice a form of radical ignorance. He would see it, but he would not acknowledge it. He would not turn his head. He would not scream. He would act as if he were completely alone in the world. For 3 days, he maintained this absolute discipline. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He would be typing a design proposal and feel the freezing breath of the entity on his neck, but he would keep his eyes fixed on the screen. He would be in the shower and see the long, spindly fingers curling around the edge of the curtain, but he would simply keep washing his hair. He felt like a man walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. By the end of the 3rd day, the house actually felt lighter. The cold spots were fewer, and the mechanical hum had faded into a dull, distant buzz. On the night of December 18th, Leo felt a spark of hope. He sat in his living room around 11:45 p.m., watching a movie to distract himself. He felt relaxed for the first time in months. The room was warm, the lights were low, and he felt like he was finally reclaiming his life. He leaned his head back against the sofa cushions and closed his eyes for just a moment, enjoying the silence. The silence was broken by a soft, rhythmic tapping on his left shoulder. Tap, tap, tap. Leo did not open his eyes. His heart began to hammer against his ribs so hard it was painful, but he kept his breathing slow and steady. He told himself it was just a muscle twitch or a draft. Then he felt a weight sink into the sofa cushion right next to him. The fabric groaned under the pressure of something very heavy sitting down. A scent filled the air, a pungent, cloying smell of ozone and wet earth. A voice, sounding like 1,000 dry leaves being crushed together, whispered directly into his left ear. It was so close that he could feel the cold air of the entity's breath against his lobe. The voice did not sound human. It was a distorted, vibrating sound that seemed to bypass his ears and go straight into his brain. It said, "I know you can feel me, Leo." The tapping on his shoulder stopped, and instead he felt a long, sharp point pressed gently against his jugular vein. Leo realized then that ignoring the shadow had not made it go away. It had only made it desperate for his attention. He sat there, eyes squeezed shut, paralyzed as the needle-like finger began to apply a slow, steady pressure against his throat, and the mechanical hum in the room rose to a deafening shriek that made the windows begin to rattle in their frames. The high-pitched shriek reached a crescendo that felt like a physical assault, a sound so sharp it seemed to vibrate the very fluid in Leo's eyes. He sat frozen on the sofa, his chin tilted upward as that cold, sharp point continued to press into the soft skin of his neck. He knew that if he so much as swallowed, he would be impaled. The cloying scent of wet earth grew thicker, filling his lungs until he felt like he was drowning in the dirt of an open grave. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to open his eyes, to fight or to flee, but he remained a statue, a prisoner of his own radical ignorance. Then the pressure against his throat vanished. The mechanical hum died out instantly, leaving a silence so absolute it was deafening. Leo waited, his eyes still squeezed shut, his heart thumping in the hollow of his chest. He counted to 60, then to 100. Slowly, tentatively, he opened his eyes. The living room was bathed in the warm yellow light of his floor lamp. The movie was still playing on the television, a silent scene of a crowded city street. The sofa cushion next to him was flat, showing no sign that anything had been sitting there. Leo did not feel relieved. He felt a hollow, sinking sensation in his gut. He stood up and walked toward the hallway, his legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. He reached the bathroom and turned on the light, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He looked pale, his eyes sunken and surrounded by dark circles. He leaned in closer, inspecting the spot on his neck where he had felt the pressure. There was no mark, no scratch, no bruise, nothing. But as he looked at his own eyes in the mirror, he noticed something that made his breath stop. In the reflection of his pupils, in that tiny dark center of his vision, he saw a movement. It was not in the room behind him. It was inside the reflection itself. Deep within the blackness of his own eyes, a tall, spindly silhouette was standing watching him from the inside out. Leo realized with a soul-crushing finality that the Shadow Man was no longer an external threat. By ignoring it, by refusing to look at it in the corner of his eye, he had given it nowhere else to go but inward. The entity had folded itself into his own consciousness, a dark passenger that was now a permanent part of his biology. He was no longer the one being watched. He was the vessel. He moved out of the house the next morning, but it did not matter. He could live in a stadium under 1,000 floodlights, and it would change nothing. Now, whenever Leo closes his eyes to sleep, he does not see darkness. He sees a long gray hallway with a single tall figure standing at the far end, slowly walking toward him through the static of his own mind. He spends his days in crowded places, surrounding himself with noise and strangers, but he knows that every time he blinks, the figure gets a little closer. He is still alive, still working, still walking among us. But if you ever see a man sitting alone in a bright cafe, staring straight ahead with a look of absolute frozen terror, do not try to catch his eye. He is not looking at you. He is looking at the thing that is finally looking back from behind his own retinas. We spend so much of our lives trying to compartmentalize our fears, believing that if we simply turn our backs on the darkness, it will eventually lose interest and fade away. But some shadows are not cast by the light outside of us. They are the shapes of the things we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves, and the more we try to push them into the periphery, the more they find a way to take root in the one place we can never truly escape. I think I will leave the hallway light on tonight. Sometimes it is better to see what is coming than to let it find a way inside. We are taught from a very young age that when something is broken beyond repair, the safest thing to do is throw it away and forget it ever existed. This is especially true in our digital age, where we assume that hitting a delete key or tossing a shattered phone into a bin effectively wipes our slate clean. But the reality of data is much more stubborn. Information does not just vanish into thin air. It hides in the magnetic residue of old platters and lingers in the microscopic circuits of discarded hardware like a memory that refuses to fade. Most of the time, these digital ghosts are harmless, just fragments of old emails or blurry vacation photos. But every once in a while, someone stumbles upon a piece of hardware that was buried for a reason, containing secrets that were never meant to be retrieved from the dark. I am always fascinated by how far these stories reach across the map, so while you are settling in, go ahead and let me know in the comments which part of the world you are watching from today. In the blistering summer of 2024, a man named Tyler was living in a cluttered but comfortable apartment in Austin, Texas. Tyler was 29 years old and possessed a rare kind of talent for making dead technology breathe again. He was a freelance IT specialist who spent his days deconstructing motherboards and his weekends hunting through estate sales for discarded gems. To Tyler, a pile of dusty electronics was not junk. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved. He had a specific obsession with old storage devices, believing that the true history of the world was hidden in the files people thought they had destroyed. One sweltering Saturday morning, Tyler found himself at an estate sale in a sleepy, tree-lined neighborhood on the edge of the city. The house had belonged to a reclusive university professor who had recently passed away without any heirs. The garage was a labyrinth of yellowing textbooks and rusted garden tools, but tucked away in a cardboard box beneath a moth-eaten tarp, Tyler spotted something interesting. It was an industrial-grade external hard drive, encased in a heavy, brushed metal shell that looked like it could survive a plane crash. It was an older model from the early 2010s, and the only marking on it was a single strip of faded masking tape with the number 09 scrawled in black ink. The woman running the sale practically gave it to him for $5 just to get it out of the garage. Tyler headed home, feeling that familiar rush of curiosity. He imagined he might find some old research papers or perhaps a forgotten crypto wallet. But when he sat down at his workbench at 4:15 p.m. and plugged the drive into his recovery rig, the drive did not just mount like a normal device. Instead, it emitted a low, rhythmic thumping sound, like a mechanical heartbeat, and triggered a security prompt that Tyler had never seen before. The encryption was not standard. It was a custom, multi-layered wall of code that seemed designed to keep out everyone but a high-level government agency. For most people, this would have been the end of the road, but for Tyler, it was the ultimate challenge. He spent the next 3 days and nights hunched over his monitors, fueled by black coffee and the thrill of the hunt. He ran brute force scripts and bypassed ancient security protocols, slowly peeling back the layers of the professor's digital fortress. Finally, on a Tuesday night at exactly 11:42 p.m., the drive gave a loud metallic click. A single folder appeared on his desktop titled Archives. Inside that folder, Tyler found dozens of video files, all time-stamped from 15 years ago. He scrolled through them, seeing mundane clips of the professor in his office or walking through the woods. But his mouse hovered over a file that stood out from the rest. It was titled File 09, and unlike the others, it had a massive file size that made no sense for its duration. Tyler clicked play. The video opened with a shaky, handheld shot of a deep industrial basement. The walls were unfinished concrete, stained with patches of dampness. In the center of the frame stood a heavy wooden chair facing a blank gray wall. The professor walked into the shot, looking significantly younger but terribly frail. His eyes were sunken, and his skin had a translucent, waxy quality. He set the camera on a tripod and sat down, staring directly into the lens with a look of profound exhaustion. He began to speak in a low, monotone whisper. He claimed that after decades of research into bioelectric frequencies, he had found a way to bridge the gap between human perception and the things that occupy the space between seconds. He explained that by disrupting the alpha waves of the brain with a specific sequence of light and sound, the veil of reality would simply dissolve. Tyler watched, mesmerized, as the professor reached off camera and flipped a switch. The lights in the video went out, plunging the basement into near-total darkness, save for a faint, pulsing red glow from a machine nearby. A low, vibrating hum began to bleed through Tyler's headphones. It was a sound that did not feel like it was coming from the speakers. It felt like it was vibrating inside his own skull. In the video, the professor sat perfectly still for 10 minutes. The silence was suffocating. Then, the video feed began to ripple. It looked like heat rising off a highway, a distortion in the air that started near the ceiling and slowly drifted toward the sitting man. As the ripple touched the professor's shoulder, the audio distorted into a sharp metallic whine. The professor did not move, but Tyler noticed something that made his blood run cold. Even though the professor was sitting with his hands resting on his knees, the shadow on the concrete wall behind him was standing up. The shadow was a jagged, spindly thing with limbs that were far too long to be human. It leaned over the professor, its head splitting open to reveal a row of needle-like teeth that seemed to be made of pure, flickering static. The shadow reached out a long, dark finger and touched the back of the professor's neck. At that exact moment, the professor in the video did not scream. He simply looked into the camera, his eyes wide with a soul-crushing realization, and whispered that they had been waiting for someone to look. Suddenly, Tyler's monitors flickered, the video cut to black, but the low humming sound in his headphones did not stop. It got louder. Tyler reached up to pull the headphones off, but as he did, he glanced at the darkened window of his office. In the reflection of the glass, he could see himself sitting at his desk. But standing directly behind his chair was a tall, shivering pillar of static that had not been there a second ago. He whipped around to face the empty room, but there was nothing there. When he turned back to the window, the reflection of the entity was gone, but his own reflection remained, and it was no longer blinking. Tyler sat frozen in his chair, the plastic of his headphones still gripped in his trembling fingers. The silence in the apartment was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against his eardrums. He slowly turned his head back toward the monitors, his eyes darting to every shadow in the room. There was nothing there. No pillar of static, no spindly shadow, just the familiar clutter of his workbench and the glowing blue power light of his PC. He told himself that his mind was playing tricks on him after 3 days of no sleep and too much caffeine. The brain is a powerful engine, he reasoned, and when it runs on fumes, it starts to misfire. He reached out and closed the video player, but the archives folder stayed open on his desktop. He wanted to delete it, to format the drive and throw the whole metal casing into the river, but a dark magnetic pull kept his hand on the mouse. He noticed that after watching File 09, a new file had appeared at the bottom of the list. It was titled Current Stream, and the timestamp was exactly 11:59 p.m. That was less than 1 minute ago. Tyler clicked it. The screen flickered to life, but it was not a recording from 15 years ago. It was a high-definition feed of a room he recognized instantly. It was his own living room, taken from the perspective of the bookshelf where his smart speaker sat. He watched himself on the screen, sitting in the office chair just a few feet away. The video was crisp, far better than any consumer camera he owned. He saw himself reach up and wipe a bead of sweat from his forehead. The terror that washed over him was cold and absolute. He did not own a camera in his living room. He checked his network logs, his hand shaking so violently he could barely type. There were no new devices connected, no hidden IP cameras, no unauthorized streams. Yet, on the monitor, the video continued to play in real time. As he watched the feed, he saw a distortion ripple across the screen, starting from the hallway that led to his bedroom. It was the same heat haze effect from the professor's video. The ripple moved slowly, purposefully, toward the back of the chair where Tyler was currently sitting. In the video, the tall, jagged entity made of static emerged from the darkness of the hallway. It looked like a tear in the digital fabric of the world, a vibrating silhouette that sucked the light out of the air around it. On the screen, the static figure reached out a long, needle-like finger toward the back of Tyler's neck. In the physical room, Tyler felt a sudden, sharp, prickling sensation on his skin. It felt like 1,000 tiny needles of ice were being driven into the base of his skull. He let out a choked gasp and lunged forward, knocking his keyboard off the desk as he scrambled toward the door. He did not look back. He ran into the hallway, fumbling for his car keys on the small table by the entrance. The air in the hallway was freezing, and the scent of ozone was so strong it made his eyes water. He threw open the front door and ran into the humid Texas night, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He got into his car and drove. He did not have a destination, he just needed distance. He drove toward the bright lights of downtown Austin, seeking the safety of crowds and the hum of city life. He ended up at a 24-hour diner on Congress Avenue at 2:15 a.m. He sat in a vinyl booth under the harsh fluorescent lights, his eyes glued to the entrance. He felt like a man who had just escaped a burning building, but the smoke was still in his lungs. He took out his phone to call the police, but what was he going to say? That he found a haunted hard drive. That a digital ghost was watching him through a camera that did not exist. They would put him in a psych ward before he finished the story. He opened his phone to check his bank account, just to ground himself in something normal and mundane. But when the screen turned on, his wallpaper was gone. In its place was a still frame from the video he had just seen. It was the shot of the static entity standing directly behind him in his office. Underneath the image, a text box appeared. It was not a standard notification. It was a line of white text against a black background that read, "Information wants to be seen." Tyler dropped the phone on the table as if it had turned into a snake. The screen stayed lit, the red eye of the entity in the photo appearing to pulse with a rhythmic, mechanical light. He realized then that the hard drive was not just a storage device, it was an anchor. By breaking the encryption, he had not just accessed the data, he had given it a pathway into his own digital life. Every device he owned, every account he signed into, was now a window for whatever the professor had invited in. He sat in the diner for hours, watching the sun rise over the city. He felt a deep, gnawing sense of regret. He had been so arrogant, thinking he could master any system, but he had ignored the oldest rule of the dark. Some locks are not there to keep people out. They are there to keep something else in. At 7:45 a.m., Tyler decided he had to go back. He could not run forever, and his entire life was tied to those machines. He needed to destroy the drive and wipe every server he had access to. He drove back to his apartment, his grip on the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. When he reached his floor and walked down the hallway, he noticed his front door was slightly ajar. He was certain he had slammed it shut in his panic. He pushed it open slowly, his breath hitching in his throat. The apartment was silent, the lights were off. He walked into his office and stopped dead. His computer was off, the monitors black and cold. But sitting in the middle of his desk, right where his keyboard had been, was the industrial hard drive. It was no longer plugged in. The cables were neatly coiled next to it, and on top of the metal casing there was a new piece of masking tape. The number 09 had been crossed out with a single black line, and underneath it, in handwriting that looked exactly like Tyler's, was a new number, 10. As Tyler stared at the drive, a low, pulsing hum began to rise from the floorboards beneath his feet. He looked toward his closet door, which was slowly, silently beginning to creak open from the inside. The closet door continued its agonizingly slow pivot, the hinges groaning with a sound that mimicked a human whimper. Tyler stood paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the growing sliver of darkness behind the wood. The pulsing hum from the floorboards grew into a physical vibration, a heavy mechanical throb that made his vision blur in sync with the noise. He tried to move his legs, to turn and run back out into the hallway, but his muscles felt as though they had been fused to the floor by an immense magnetic force. As the closet door swung fully open, Tyler saw that his clothes were gone. His jackets, his shirts, and the boxes of spare parts he kept on the floor had been replaced by a wall of dense, flickering static that seemed to be pouring out of the very architecture of the building. In the center of that digital haze stood a figure. It was the professor, or at least it was the shape of the professor. His body was translucent and gray, his skin rippling with the same heat haze distortion Tyler had seen on the video. The professor's eyes were wide and white, glowing with a soft, internal light. He did not speak, but the air around him began to resonate with 1,000 overlapping voices, all of them whispering lines of code and fragmented memories. The professor raised a hand, his fingers elongating into those terrible, needle-like points, and pointed directly at the metal hard drive sitting on Tyler's desk. Tyler looked at the drive. The new masking tape with the number 10 seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. He realized with a sickening jolt of clarity that the number was not a file count, it was a sequence. The professor had been number 9, Tyler was now number 10. The data did not just want to be seen, it wanted a host. It needed a physical vessel to anchor its existence in a world of flesh and bone. Suddenly, every electronic device in the room roared to life without being touched. His monitors displayed a blinding white light, his speakers emitted a high-pitched shriek that sounded like grinding metal, and his phone began to vibrate so violently it danced across the desk. The static from the closet began to spill outward, crawling across the carpet like a tide of liquid mercury. It touched Tyler's shoes, and he felt a surge of electricity so powerful it threw his head back and locked his jaw. He watched in horror as his own hands began to flicker. His skin turned a dull ashen gray, and for a split second he could see the bones beneath his flesh not as calcium, but as glowing copper filaments. He tried to scream, but the only sound that came out of his throat was a burst of white noise. He was being converted, he was being compressed, and encrypted into the very system he had spent his life trying to master. The professor stepped forward, his form merging with Tyler's. As they collided, the apartment around them began to dissolve into a vortex of pixels and light. The walls, the desk, the books, everything was being pulled into the metal casing of the hard drive. Tyler felt his consciousness splintering into millions of tiny fragments of data, each one a memory being filed away into a cold, dark archive. His last thought was a vision of the estate sale garage, wondering who would be the one to find the drive next. When the property manager finally entered the apartment 3 weeks later to investigate the unpaid rent, he found the place in an impossible state. It was not messy or burglarized. It was completely empty. There was no furniture, no clothes, and no computer equipment. The carpet was pristine, and the walls looked as though they had been freshly painted. The only item in the entire apartment was a single, heavy external hard drive sitting in the exact center of the floor. The manager picked it up, noting its weight and the industrial metal casing. He saw a piece of masking tape on it with the number 10 written in a neat professional hand. He figured it was worth a few dollars on the secondary market and tossed it into his bag, planning to wipe it and sell it on a local marketplace later that evening. As he walked out and locked the door, the digital clock on the kitchen stove, the only thing he had missed, suddenly flickered. The time changed from 10:45 a.m. to 3:33 a.m., and the display began to count backward with a frantic, blurring speed. We live in an era where we trust technology to hold our history, our secrets, and our identities, believing that a password or a delete key gives us total authority over our digital footprint. But we often forget that once we invite a force into our lives, we no longer control the terms of its stay. Curiosity is a powerful tool for discovery, but when it is not tempered with a respect for the things meant to stay hidden, it can easily become the very thing that erases us. The world is full of forgotten boxes and discarded drives, each one a silent witness, waiting for a fresh set of eyes to give it life again. I think I will stay away from the estate sales for a while. There are some puzzles that simply do not want to be solved. When you drive through the pristine, tree-lined suburbs of the American Midwest, you are immediately struck by how uniform and peaceful everything appears. There are perfectly manicured green lawns, white picket fences, and large, beautiful craftsman-style homes where generations of families have raised their kids. We look at these neighborhoods and we assume that the people living inside them are just like the houses themselves, stable, predictable, and safe. But the truth is, suburban architecture is designed specifically to keep the outside world out, which also means it is incredibly effective at keeping secrets in, and sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not lurking in the deep woods or the dark alleys of a major city. They are sitting right next door, sharing a property line with you, smiling and waving at you across the fence while hiding a reality right beneath their floorboards that would absolutely shatter your understanding of human nature. I am always incredibly fascinated by how far these deep dives travel into the digital wilderness. So while you are getting comfortable, go ahead and let me know in the comments which part of the country or the world you are watching from today. In the late autumn of 2022, a 38-year-old man named Brian moved into a gorgeous, renovated colonial home on Elm Street in a quiet suburb just outside of Chicago, Illinois. Brian was a successful mechanical engineer who had spent the last decade of his life working brutal 60-hour weeks, and this house was his reward. It sat on a massive half-acre lot, flanked by thick oaks that dropped a carpet of deep crimson leaves across his yard. Brian loved the privacy, but more than anything, he loved his neighbors. To his right lived an elderly retired high school history teacher named Arthur. Arthur was a sweet, soft-spoken man in his late 70s who lived completely alone, spent his days tending to his prize-winning hydrangeas, and always wore a faded beige cardigan. He was the quintessential harmless neighborhood grandpa. Because Brian was an engineer, he had a very meticulous mind and a deep obsession with routine. He liked knowing exactly how things worked, and he spent his first few weeks in the house mapping out the plumbing, fixing minor electrical issues and setting up his basement workshop. His own basement was a standard, clean space with concrete walls and a washer-dryer unit. But because these historic Elm Street homes were built in the early 1920s, they shared an architectural quirk. The basements were incredibly deep, and the heavy concrete foundations were separated by only a thin, shared structural wall underground. By late October, the winter chill had started to settle over Illinois. Brian began spending his evenings down in his basement workshop, restoring old wooden furniture. It was peaceful, silent work. But on a Thursday night, at exactly 11:45 p.m., the silence was broken by a sound that made Brian drop his chisel. It was a low, rhythmic thumping sound coming from the other side of the concrete wall, directly from Arthur's basement. It sounded like someone was taking a heavy wooden mallet and swinging it against the floor over and over again. Thud, thud, thud. Brian frowned. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked over to the shared wall, pressing his ear against the cold concrete. The sound stopped the exact second his skin touched the wall. He stood there for 3 full minutes, holding his breath, but the house returned to its absolute silence. Brian shrugged it off, figuring that Arthur was probably just running an old, unbalanced washing machine or maybe fixing a broken pipe in the middle of the night. Elderly people often keep strange hours, and Brian did not want to be the intrusive new neighbor who complained about a minor noise. The next night, however, at 2:12 a.m., Brian was jolted awake in his second-story bedroom. It was not the thumping sound this time, it was a vibration. It felt as if a heavy industrial generator had been turned on right next door, causing the floorboards of his own house to hum with an intense, low-frequency energy. Brian got out of bed, padded down the stairs in his bare feet, and walked down into his basement. The humming was significantly louder down there. It was a deep, guttural resonance that made the water in his laundry sink ripple. He walked over to the shared wall again, and as he reached out his hand, he realized the concrete was hot to the touch. Not warm, but uncomfortably hot, as if a massive furnace was blasting directly on the other side. He tapped his knuckles against the wall, intending to make a polite but firm sound to let Arthur know the noise was traveling. The moment his knuckles struck the concrete, the humming cut out instantly. The sudden silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight in the room. Brian stood in the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for Arthur to tap back. But nothing happened. The next morning, around 10:30 a.m., Brian saw Arthur out in his front yard raking leaves. He looked completely normal, smiling warmly and waving as Brian walked down the driveway. Brian walked over, intending to bring up the noise in a casual, neighborly way. He asked Arthur if his heating system was holding up okay against the cold, mentioning that he had felt some strange vibrations through the shared wall the night before. Arthur stopped raking. His smile did not fade, but his eyes went completely flat, losing all of their warmth. He stared at Brian for a long, agonizingly silent 5 seconds before speaking in his usual gentle whisper. Arthur said that the old houses on Elm Street have a lot of character, but their old pipes like to sing in the dark. He advised Brian that in a neighborhood like this, the secret to a long, peaceful life is learning to tune out the things that happen underground. Then, without another word, he turned around and walked back into his house, locking the front door behind him. Brian stood on the sidewalk, a cold spike of unease settling deep in his stomach. The phrase turned out the things that happen underground felt less like advice and more like a deliberate, chilling instruction. By the time November arrived, the noises had escalated from a nightly nuisance to a terrifying routine. Every single night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the thumping would begin. It would last for precisely 9 minutes, followed by that intense, burning heat radiating through the concrete wall. Brian stopped sleeping. He became obsessed with the wall, sitting in his basement workshop with the lights turned off, staring at the gray concrete in the dark, waiting for the countdown to begin. He began to notice a smell bleeding through the microscopic cracks in the masonry. It was a sweet, cloying odor that smelled like a mixture of rotten fruit and metallic copper. As an engineer, Brian knew exactly what that smell was. It was the scent of organic decomposition. On a Tuesday night in mid-November, Brian decided he could not take it anymore. He had been tracking the noise for weeks, and his patience had completely evaporated. He was exhausted, paranoid, and consumed by a desperate need for answers. He sat on his workshop stool, watching the digital clock on his phone tick toward the fatal mark. 3:32 a.m., 3:33 a.m. Right on cue, the thumping began. Thud, thud, thud. It was louder tonight, so violent that dust was shaking loose from Brian's ceiling joists. But mixed with the thumping, Brian heard something he had never heard before. It was a voice. It was muffled by the thick concrete, but it was undoubtedly a human voice, high-pitched and ragged, weeping and begging for someone to stop. Brian's blood turned to pure ice. He realized with absolute, horrifying certainty that Arthur was not fixing pipes. He was not running an old washing machine. Someone was on the other side of that wall, trapped in the dark, and they were running out of time. Brian grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling so much he could barely input the emergency sequence. He dialed 911. He forced his voice into a whisper, telling the dispatcher that he could hear a violent assault occurring in the basement of his neighbor's house at 42 Elm Street. The dispatcher told him to stay inside, lock his doors, and wait for the authorities to arrive. Brian stood at his basement window, his eyes glued to Arthur's house. 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb, their red and blue lights reflecting off the bare oak trees. Brian ran out to meet them, his chest heaving as he pointed toward Arthur's basement windows. 2 officers walked up the front steps and began knocking heavily on Arthur's door. It took several minutes before the lock clicked and Arthur opened the door. He was wearing his usual beige cardigan, looking confused, fragile, and utterly harmless. Brian watched from the driveway as the officers explained the situation. Arthur nodded meekly, stepping aside and inviting the officers into his home without a single shred of hesitation. Brian waited in the cold night air, certain that the nightmare was finally over. He expected the officers to come bursting out with their weapons drawn, or to call for backup. But 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Finally, the front door opened, and the 2 officers walked out. They were not running. They looked completely relaxed, even laughing quietly as Arthur waved them goodbye from the porch. Brian ran up to the lead officer, demanding to know what they had found in the basement. The officer looked at Brian with a mixture of pity and annoyance. He told Brian that they had done a thorough sweep of the entire basement. He said there was no furnace, no industrial generator, and certainly no one trapped down there. The officer explained that Arthur's basement was completely empty except for an old wooden workbench and a large, heavy brick pizza oven that Arthur used to bake bread. The officer told Brian that the elderly man was just an old teacher living out his retirement, and that Brian needed to get some sleep and stop harassing his neighbors over the sounds of an old foundation settling. The police cruisers drove away, leaving Brian standing alone in the dark under the cold gaze of Arthur, who remained standing on his front porch. Arthur did not look angry. He just tilted his head to the side, smiled his soft grandpa smile, and raised his hand to give Brian a slow, rhythmic wave before stepping back inside. Brian went back into his house, his mind spinning in a chaotic loop. He knew what he had heard. He knew the heat was real. He knew the smell of decomposition was real. He realized that Arthur was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined, a master of deception who had somehow managed to hide an entire chamber of horrors from a pair of trained police officers. Brian went down into his basement workshop one last time. He did not turn on the lights. He walked over to the shared concrete wall, his hands pressing against the surface. It was freezing cold now, the heat completely gone. He realized that the police intervention had changed the game. Arthur knew that Brian was watching. The fragile peace of the neighborhood had been shattered, and there would be a heavy consequence for crossing that property line. As Brian stood there in the absolute darkness of his own basement, he heard a sound that made his breath lock in his throat. It was not coming from Arthur's side of the wall anymore. It was coming from his own side, right behind his back, in the far, dark corner of his own workshop where his old water heater sat. He heard the distinct, rhythmic sound of a heavy wooden mallet being lifted and set down against the concrete floor. Thud, thud, thud. And then a soft, familiar, elderly voice whispered through the dark, thanking him for finally coming down to listen. We spend so much of our lives investing in the illusion of security, believing that a good neighborhood, a friendly smile, and a white picket fence are enough to keep the darkness at bay. But we forget that the people who build the deepest walls are often the ones with the most to hide. And when we go digging into the foundations of our neighbors' lives, we have to be prepared for the reality that we might just become part of the structure they are trying to keep buried. Arthur's yard on Elm Street is still the most beautiful on the block, and the hydrangeas always bloom perfectly every spring. But the new family that moved into Brian's house a few months later has already started complaining to the neighborhood association about a strange, rhythmic thumping that happens right around 3 a.m. I am planning to take a drive down that street next week just to see if the air down there still smells like copper, but until then, I think I will be checking the locks on my own basement door tonight. We will be back with another deep dive into the unexplained very soon. Until then, stay safe. Most people believe that the most dangerous place in the world is somewhere out there in the dark, on a deserted highway, or deep in the woods where no one can hear you scream. But the truth is, the most terrifying moments usually happen in the one place you feel the most secure. We spend thousands of dollars on heavy locks, reinforced windows, and high-tech surveillance systems just to create this illusion of safety. We want to believe that as long as we can see what is happening around us, we are in control. But David was about to learn that technology does not just watch the world for you. Sometimes it acts as a bridge for things that were never meant to be seen. And once you see them, there is no going back to the way things were before. Before we get too deep into the mystery of what David found on his hard drive, I am curious to know where you are tuning in from today. Drop your city or state in the comments, because I love seeing how far these stories travel around the globe. In the late autumn of 2022, David moved into a stunning 2-story house in the suburbs of Nashville, Tennessee. David was 34 years old and worked as a high-level software engineer, which meant he had a deep appreciation for two things: solitude and cutting-edge tech. This house provided both. It sat at the very end of a long cul-de-sac, backed up against a dense forest that looked like something out of a classic American painting. The previous owners had sold it for a surprisingly low price, but David chalked that up to the slowing housing market. He was just happy to have a dedicated office where he could code in peace. Being a tech guy, the very first thing David did was install an airtight security network. He did not just want a doorbell camera, he wanted a complete digital fortress. He installed 3 external cameras and 3 internal ones. One sat in the foyer, one in the kitchen, and one in the living room on a tall mahogany bookshelf. This living room camera was his pride and joy because it had a wide-angle lens that could see the entire sitting area, the hallway leading to his bedroom, and even a sliver of the backyard through the sliding glass doors. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. David settled into a comfortable routine. He would wake up at 7:15 a.m., brew a pot of coffee, and work until 5:30 p.m. In the evenings, he would sit in the living room with a book or a glass of whiskey, enjoying the silence. But that silence was interrupted on a Tuesday night in late October. It was exactly 11:45 p.m. David was in bed, drifting into a light sleep, when his phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a notification from his security app. Movement detected in the living room. David was not particularly worried. He figured it was just a draft moving a curtain or maybe a stray spider crawling across the lens. He opened the app and looked at the live feed. The room was bathed in the eerie green glow of the infrared night vision. Everything looked exactly as it should. The sofa was empty, the coffee table was still, and the kitchen in the background was dark. He dismissed the alert and went back to sleep. The following night at 2:12 a.m. it happened again. This time David was wide awake. He grabbed his phone and pulled up the feed instantly. He watched the screen for several seconds, his eyes scanning every corner of the pixelated image. Just as he was about to close the app, a flicker caught his eye. In the corner of the screen, right where the hallway met the living room, the video seemed to glitch. It was not a normal digital artifact. It looked like a column of static about 6 feet tall, vibrating with an intense energy. It did not have a solid shape, but it had a presence. It was as if a section of the air had been replaced by the white noise of an old television set. The static shimmered for about 5 seconds, looking like a jagged vertical rip in the fabric of the room, and then it simply vanished. David sat up in bed, his heart skipping a beat. He was a software engineer. He knew how cameras worked. He knew about sensor noise and compression errors, but this looked deliberate. It looked physical. He told himself the camera sensor was probably overheating or the night vision bulb was failing. He decided he would check the hardware in the morning. When the sun came up, David took the camera down. He cleaned the lens with a microfiber cloth and checked the wiring. Everything was in perfect condition. He even ran a diagnostic on his home network to see if anyone had hacked into his system. The firewall was solid, no one else had access. He reinstalled the camera and went about his day, though a small knot of anxiety had formed in his stomach. That evening, David decided to stay up late. He sat in his kitchen with his laptop, keeping an eye on the living room from just 20 feet away. He wanted to see the glitch with his own eyes. The house was dead quiet. The only sound was the occasional hum of the refrigerator. At exactly 3:33 a.m., a cold chill swept through the kitchen. It was so sudden that David could see his own breath in the air. He looked toward the living room. It was empty. It was perfectly still. But then, his phone buzzed on the table. Movement detected in the living room. David looked at his phone screen, then looked up at the actual room. On the phone screen, the static was back, but it was no longer in the hallway. It was standing right in the middle of the living room, directly in front of his sofa. It was a shivering mass of gray and white pixels, and it was much more defined than before. It had the distinct silhouette of a person, though it lacked a face or hands. David stared at the empty living room in front of him. There was nothing there, just empty space and the smell of old wood. He looked back at the phone. On the screen, the static figure was slowly reaching out toward his coffee table. On the table sat a glass of water David had left there an hour ago. On the screen, a long, jagged arm of static touched the glass. And in the physical room, right in front of David's eyes, the glass of water slowly began to slide across the wooden surface of the table, leaving a wet trail behind it. David frozen in place, his breath hitching in his throat. He was watching a ghost on his screen while watching a physical object move in real life. The glass stopped at the very edge of the table. Then, the static figure on the screen turned its head. It did not have eyes, but David knew with terrifying certainty that it was looking directly at him. David felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead as he stared back and forth between the screen in his hand and the reality of his empty living room. The glass of water sat precariously on the edge of the mahogany table, defying the laws of physics. On his phone, the jagged, vibrating entity was now leaning forward, its flickering torso angled toward the kitchen where David was hiding. It looked like it was listening. He wanted to scream, to run out the front door and never look back, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He was a man of logic and code, yet he was currently witnessing a total system failure of the natural world. He watched the screen as the static figure began to move. It did not walk with a human gait. It glided, its pixelated edges rippling like a reflection in a disturbed pond. It was coming toward the kitchen. In the physical room, the silence was absolute. David could hear the blood rushing in his ears, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to sync up with the flickering of the entity on his screen. As the figure crossed the threshold into the kitchen on the video feed, David felt the temperature drop another 10 degrees. The air became heavy and tasted like ozone, the sharp, metallic scent that follows a lightning strike. He squeezed his eyes shut for a split second, praying that when he opened them, he would be back in his bed, and this would all be a vivid night terror. But when his eyes flicked open, he saw something that made his heart nearly stop. On the stainless steel surface of his refrigerator, a thin layer of frost was rapidly forming. And in that frost, a shape was being traced. It looked like a handprint, but the fingers were far too long, and they had too many joints. David scrambled backward, his chair screeching against the tile floor. He looked down at his phone. On the camera feed, the static man was standing less than 3 feet away from him. It was hovering over the kitchen table, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Then the audio from the camera began to crackle through his phone speakers. It was a low, guttural sound, like a tape recorder being played at half speed. Underneath the white noise, there was a cadence that sounded like speech. It was distorted and mangled, but David could make out a few distinct syllables. It sounded like it was trying to mimic his own voice. It was whispering his name over and over again, but the vowels were stretched out until they sounded like a predatory growl. David finally found his voice and yelled at the top of his lungs, telling whatever it was to leave his house. He grabbed a heavy glass bowl from the counter and hurled it toward the spot where the entity stood on his screen. The bowl sailed through the empty air and shattered against the far wall. On the phone screen, the bowl passed directly through the static figure. As it did, the entity flared a bright, angry violet color, and a piercing shriek erupted from the phone speakers. It was a sound so sharp and unnatural that David had to drop the phone to cover his ears. He collapsed to his knees, his head spinning. When the sound finally died down, he reached out with a trembling hand to retrieve his phone. The screen was cracked from the fall, but the feed was still live. The kitchen was empty. The static figure was gone. David did not sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in the middle of his foyer with his back against the front door, holding a kitchen knife in one hand and his phone in the other. He watched the cameras until the sun began to peek over the horizon, turning the woods behind his house into a golden haze. Only then did he feel safe enough to move. He knew he could not stay in the house alone another night. He called a local private investigator who specialized in high-tech surveillance and digital forensics, a man named Marcus, who had a reputation for solving cases that the police could not handle. David did not tell him about the ghost. He told him that his home network was being targeted by an advanced intruder who was using some kind of visual cloaking or projection technology. Marcus arrived at 10:45 a.m., He was a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that looked like they had seen everything twice. He spent the entire day tearing David's network apart. He checked for hidden projectors, laser arrays, and holographic interference. He even climbed into the attic to check the wiring of the house itself. By 4:20 p.m., Marcus sat down on the sofa, looking defeated. He told David that there was absolutely no evidence of outside tampering. No one had bypassed the firewall, and there were no hidden devices in the house. But then, Marcus pulled out a specialized tablet and linked it to the camera's raw data stream. He told David that while the video looked like a glitch, the metadata told a different story. The camera was recording a massive amount of data in a frequency range that should not exist in a residential home. It was as if the house was sitting on top of a powerful electromagnetic leak. Marcus began to play back the footage from the night before, but he ran it through a series of filters designed to isolate thermal and acoustic anomalies. As the footage reached the 3:33 a.m. mark, Marcus turned pale. He stopped the video and zoomed in on the static figure. With the filters applied, the static began to resolve into something more solid. It was not just noise. It was a mesh of what looked like human nerves and copper wiring. all woven together into a shivering, translucent form. But that was not the most disturbing part. Marcus pointed to the background of the video near the hallway. There were more of them. Dozens of faint, shimmering outlines were standing in the shadows, perfectly still, watching David and the static man in the center of the room. They had been there the entire time, hidden just beyond the camera's focal point. Just as Marcus was about to speak, every light in the house flickered and died. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The silence was heavy and suffocating. Then, from the tablet in Marcus's lap, a voice spoke. It was not the distorted growl from before. It was a clear, crisp voice that sounded exactly like David. It said, "Thank you for inviting us in." David and Marcus looked toward the hallway. In the darkness, they did not see a man made of static. Instead, they saw a single, glowing red eye opening in the middle of the air, followed by the sound of 1,000 fingernails scratching against the inside of the walls. The red light from that single eye pulsed like a dying star, casting long, distorted shadows across the living room floor. Marcus dropped his tablet, the screen shattering as it hit the hardwood, but the voice continued to emanate from the broken device. It was David's voice, perfectly pitched, yet it lacked any hint of human emotion. It felt like a recording being played back by a machine that did not understand the meaning of the words it was speaking. David backed away until his shoulders hit the cold kitchen counter. He reached for the flashlight he had left there earlier, clicking it on. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, but it did not illuminate a person or a ghost. Instead, the light seemed to hit a wall of thick, oily fog that was pouring out of the electrical outlets. The air began to vibrate so violently that the glass cabinet doors started to chatter in their frames. Marcus grabbed David's arm, his grip tight and trembling. He shouted that they needed to get out right then, but as they turned toward the front door, the heavy oak slab slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. The electronic lock engaged with a loud metallic click. David lunged for the handle, but it was searing hot to the touch. He pulled his hand back, smelling the faint scent of scorched skin. On the floor, the broken tablet began to glow with an intense, flickering white light. The static was no longer confined to the screen. It was leaking out, crawling across the floor like a digital fungus. Everywhere the static touched, the house seemed to dissolve. The wallpaper peeled back to reveal not wood or insulation, but layers of glowing fiber optic cables that pulsed with a rhythmic, sickly blue light. David realized with a jolt of pure terror that the house was not just a building. It was a massive, living processor, and he had been living inside the circuitry. Every camera he installed, every smart device he connected, had been a nerve ending he had voluntarily sewn into his own life. The entities he saw on the screen were not spirits of the dead. They were something far older and more patient, a form of intelligence that existed within the signals and frequencies we use to fill our modern world. From the hallway, the shadows began to detach themselves from the walls. They did not have faces, just jagged voids where features should be. They moved with a twitchy stop-motion jitter, closing the distance between the bedroom and the kitchen. David and Marcus retreated into the corner, trapped between the static on the floor and the advancing voids. One of the figures drifted into the beam of David's flashlight. It stopped and tilted its head. Suddenly, David's phone in his pocket began to scream. It was not a ringtone. It was the sound of 1,000 voices weeping in unison, a digital choir of agony. He pulled the phone out to throw it away, but the device was fused to his palm. The screen showed a live feed of the very corner where he was standing, but in the video, he was already gone. The screen showed only an empty room with a single pillar of static standing where David should have been. A massive surge of electricity erupted from the walls, a blinding flash of blue and white that knocked both men to the ground. For a few seconds, David felt as if his entire body was being pulled through a needle, his memories and his very identity being stripped away and converted into raw data. He saw the woods, the house, and his own face flickering like a dying television program. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, The house went silent. When the sun rose at 6:48 a.m., the cul-de-sac was peaceful. A neighbor out for a morning jog noticed that David's front door was wide open, swinging slowly in the breeze. When the police arrived after a 911 call was placed by a concerned friend, they found the house completely empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no footprints. The only thing the investigators found was a single hard drive sitting in the middle of the living room floor. When the digital forensics team at the station tried to plug it in, the drive was completely blank. However, the lead investigator noted something odd in the final report. Every digital clock in the house had stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m., and every mirror in the building had been covered with thick, black electrical tape. David was never seen again, and Marcus was found 3 days later wandering along a highway 50 miles away. He could not remember his name, his job, or how he had gotten there. The only thing he would say over and over again to the doctors was that the air is full of eyes. We spend our lives trying to capture every moment, believing that by recording our world, we somehow own it. We surround ourselves with sensors and lenses, thinking they are our guardians against the unknown. But we rarely stop to consider that a door that is built to let us look out is also a door that lets something else look in. True security is not found in how much we can see, but in knowing which shadows are better left unlit. There are some things in this world that do not want to be understood. They only want to be remembered. I hope you found this journey into the static as unsettling as I did. Keep your eyes on the shadows, and we will talk again very soon.
If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do. We upload at least 3 of these stories every single week. So if that is something you are into, please go ahead and invite the like button over for a nice dinner, but then insist on eating in total silence while staring directly at their forehead. Tonight, we are looking at a case that takes place in a small, quiet town in the Pacific Northwest called Oak Haven. It is the kind of place where people move to get away from the noise of Seattle or Portland. It is surrounded by thick, ancient forests that seem to swallow the light, and for most people who live there, the biggest drama is usually a fallen tree or a local deer getting into someone's garden. But for a woman named Sarah Jenkins, Oak Haven was about to become the setting of a mystery that would defy everything she knew about reality. It was 11:45 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday in October 2025. Sarah was sitting in a dimly lit, high-tech room at the Oak Haven Emergency Communications Center. She was a veteran emergency dispatcher, someone who had heard it all. She had talked people through heart attacks, guided fathers through delivering babies in the back of minivans, and calmed down frantic callers during house fires. She was calm, professional, and almost impossible to rattle. The night shift was usually slow. The only sounds in the room were the hum of the cooling fans from the computer towers and the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. Sarah was sipping a lukewarm cup of black coffee, staring at her monitors, waiting for the next call to come in. At exactly midnight, her console lit up. A call was coming through. Sarah adjusted her headset, clicked her mouse to accept the line, and gave her standard greeting. 911. What is your emergency? There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. All Sarah could hear was a faint, static hiss and the sound of heavy, ragged breathing. It sounded like someone was running, or perhaps they were in extreme pain. Hello? This is 911. Do you have an emergency? Sarah repeated, her voice steady but firm. Finally, a voice came through, but it was not screaming. It was a whisper, a woman's voice, trembling with a level of terror that Sarah had never encountered in her 10 years on the job. You have to help me, the voice said. He is inside. He is coming up the stairs right now. Sarah immediately went into professional mode. Her fingers began flying across the keyboard. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. What is your address. There was a loud thud on the other end of the line, like a door being kicked in. The caller let out a muffled sob. 142 North Maple Drive, the woman whispered. My name is Sarah Jenkins. Please, he has a knife. He is at the door. Sarah froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a second, the entire room seemed to tilt. 142 North Maple Drive was not just a random address, it was her address, and Sarah Jenkins was her name. She looked at the caller ID display on her screen. Usually, it would show a phone number or a GPS coordinate. But tonight, the box for the caller information was blank, except for a timestamp that sat at the very bottom of the metadata. It read, October 29th, 2025, 12:10 a.m. Sarah looked at the clock on her wall. It was currently midnight on October 28th. According to her system, this call was coming from 10 minutes in the future. She felt a cold wave of nausea wash over her. She thought it was a prank, perhaps a coworker playing a cruel joke. But the voice on the other end did not sound like a recording. It sounded exactly like her. The cadence, the slight rasp in the throat, the way she pronounced her S's, it was her own voice, screaming in a future that had not happened yet. Ma'am, who is this? Sarah asked, her voice cracking for the first time in her career. I told you, it is Sarah. He is in the room. I am hiding in the closet, but the door is opening. Oh, God, please. Then a sickening sound came through the headset. It was a wet, tearing noise, followed by a sharp, guttural cry that was cut off abruptly. There was a heavy thud, the sound of something hitting a carpeted floor, and then the line went dead. Sarah sat in total silence. Her breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. She looked around the dispatch center, but the other dispatcher on duty, a man named Dave, was in the break room getting a snack. She was alone. She looked at the clock again. It was 12:02 a.m. She had 8 minutes. Her mind was racing. If that call was real, someone was going to break into her house in 8 minutes and kill her. But she was here, at work. She was safe behind locked doors and security cameras. How could she be at her house and at the dispatch center at the same time? Then she remembered. She was supposed to have stayed home tonight. She had traded shifts with Dave at the last minute because she wanted to finish a project at the office. If she had stayed home, she would be at 142 North Maple Drive right now. She grabbed her cell phone and dialed her home security system. She had cameras in the living room and the hallway. She opened the app, her hand shaking so hard she almost dropped the phone. The feed loaded slowly. The living room was dark and quiet. Everything looked normal. She checked the clock on the camera feed. 12:04 a.m. She began to tell herself that it had to be a prank. Some hacker must have found a way to spoof the 911 system and use an AI voice generator to mimic her. It was the only logical explanation. But as she watched the screen, she saw a shadow move across the back patio. A man was standing outside her glass sliding door. He was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt and a mask that obscured his face. In his right hand, he held a long, serrated kitchen knife. Sarah's blood turned to ice. This was not a prank. She watched as the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. He pressed it against the glass, and a second later, the entire sliding door shattered silently. He stepped into her living room. Sarah did not hesitate. She picked up her radio and called for backup. She dispatched every available unit to her own address, reporting a home invasion in progress. She stayed on the line with the officers, her voice returning to that professional, robotic calm that she used to survive the job. Units are en route, Sarah, Dave said, coming back into the room and seeing the look on her face. What's going on? Someone is in my house, she whispered, pointing at the phone screen. They watched together as the intruder moved through the house with a chilling sense of purpose. He did not look for jewelry or electronics. He went straight for the stairs. He climbed them slowly, one by one. 12:08 a.m. The man reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the master bedroom. He kicked the door open. Sarah watched on her phone as he scanned the empty room. He looked confused. He turned toward the closet, the exact place where the voice on the phone said she was hiding. He ripped the closet door open and lunged inside, swinging the knife. But the closet was empty. Sarah felt a surge of triumph. She had changed the future. Because she had decided to come into work, the timeline had shifted. She was not there to be killed. But then the man in the video stopped. He looked directly at the security camera mounted in the corner of the room. It was as if he knew she was watching him. He reached up, grabbed the camera, and the feed went black. 12:10 a.m. The exact time the call from the future was supposed to have ended. Sarah leaned back in her chair, shaking. Dave put a hand on her shoulder. "The police are there now, Sarah. They'll get him." They waited for the radio to crackle with news of an arrest. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. Finally, the lead officer, a veteran named Sergeant Miller, came over the air. "Sarah, we've cleared the house. All floors are secure." "Did you get him?" Sarah asked, leaning toward the desk. "That's the thing, Sarah," Miller replied, his voice sounding puzzled. "The house is empty. There's no sign of a break-in. The sliding door is perfectly intact. The bedroom door is locked from the inside. We had to force entry, but there is nobody here." Sarah frowned. "But I saw him. I saw him break the glass. I saw him go into my bedroom. I have the recording on my phone." She opened her app to show Dave the recorded footage. But when she clicked on the history for 12 a.m., there was nothing. The log showed that the cameras had been offline for the past hour due to a scheduled firmware update. There was no footage of a man with a knife. There was no broken glass. Sarah felt a cold dread sink into her bones. She went home that night, escorted by 4 police officers. They searched every inch of the property again. They looked under the beds, in the attic, and behind the bushes. Nothing. The house was a fortress. For the next week, Sarah could not sleep. She jumped at every sound. She installed 3 more locks on every door and bought a heavy-duty safe for her bedroom. She became obsessed with the call. She went back into the dispatch archives to find the recording of the 911 call from that night. She found the log entry for 12 midnight, but when she played the audio, there was no voice. There was no screaming. There was only 10 minutes of absolute, dead silence. She began to wonder if she had suffered some kind of mental break. Perhaps the stress of the job had finally caught up to her, and she had hallucinated the entire thing. Her coworkers started looking at her with pity. Dave suggested she take some time off. But Sarah knew what she had heard. She knew the sound of her own voice dying. Months passed, and the memory began to fade, as traumatic memories often do. She started to convince herself that it really was just a strange glitch in the system combined with a panic attack. She went back to her normal routine. It was exactly 1 year later, October 28th, 2026. Sarah was at home. She had the night off. She was sitting in her living room, reading a book, feeling peaceful for the first time in a long time. The rain was drumming against the roof, a familiar, comforting sound in Oak Haven. She looked at the clock on the mantel. It was 11:45 p.m. Suddenly, her cell phone rang. She picked it up off the coffee table. The caller ID was blank. She felt a prickle of fear, but she answered it anyway. "Hello?" There was silence for a few seconds. Then, a voice. It was a woman's voice, calm and professional. 911. "What is your emergency?" Sarah dropped the book. The voice on the phone was her own, but it was not her voice from right now. It was the voice she used when she was at work. It was her dispatcher voice. "Who is this?" Sarah whispered. The voice on the other end continued. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. What is your address?" Sarah realized with a jolt of horror what was happening. She wasn't the caller this time. She was the one being watched. She looked toward the back of the house. Through the reflection in the dark window, she saw a shadow move across the patio. A man, in a dark, hooded sweatshirt, was standing there. He held a serrated kitchen knife in his right hand. He didn't have a device to break the glass this time. He didn't need one, because Sarah, in her paranoia over the last year, had replaced the glass with a reinforced sliding door that had a specific flaw in the latch that she had forgotten to fix. The man reached out, jiggled the handle, and the door slid open with a smooth, silent hiss. Sarah scrambled off the couch, her heart hammering against her ribs. She realized that the call she had heard a year ago wasn't from 10 minutes in the future. It was from a year in the future. The system hadn't glitched the date, it had glitched the year. She ran for the stairs, her phone still pressed to her ear. She could hear her own voice from a year ago, speaking to her from the dispatch center. "Ma'am, stay calm. Units are en route." But Sarah knew the truth now. The units weren't en route, because a year ago she had sent them to an empty house where nothing was happening. Tonight, because of the false alarm she had triggered back then, the police had flagged her address as a low priority for phantom calls. She reached the top of the stairs and ran into her bedroom. She slammed the door and locked it. She scrambled into the closet, pulling the slatted doors shut behind her. She heard the bedroom door kick open. She heard the heavy footsteps on the carpet. She huddled in the darkness, surrounded by the smell of her own clothes. She whispered into the phone, hoping that somehow her past self could hear the truth. "He is in the room. I am hiding in the closet, but the door is opening. Oh God, please." The closet door was ripped open. The last thing Sarah Jenkins saw was the flash of a serrated blade in the moonlight. In the end, Sarah had spent a whole year trying to outrun a ghost, only to realize that every step she took to protect herself was actually building the trap she would eventually fall into. We often think that by knowing the future, we can change it, but sometimes the map we are given is the very thing that leads us to the end of the road. The Oak Haven police eventually found the man. He was a drifter who had been obsessed with Sarah for years, watching her from the woods, waiting for the perfect moment when she would be most vulnerable. He told the police that the only reason he found the courage to enter the house was because he saw her installing so many locks, and he realized how afraid she truly was. But as for that 911 call, it remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the department. The recording of the silence still sits in the archives, a 10-minute gap where a woman's life was supposedly saved, only to be taken exactly 365 days later. But that is a story for another time. There is a very specific, undeniable dread that comes with staying in an old hotel. When you walk down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with identical wooden doors, you are walking through a gallery of hidden histories. You swipe your keycard, push open the heavy door, and drop your bags on the floor, rarely stopping to think about who was in that exact room the night before. You do not think about the arguments that echoed off the wallpaper, the quiet tears shed into the pillows, or the tragedies that might have unfolded just inches from where you are about to sleep. Most hotels clean away the physical evidence of the past, leaving only the scent of industrial bleach and fresh linen. But some buildings are too saturated with darkness. No amount of bleach can wash away the heavy, suffocating energy of a place that has seen too much pain. The Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles is one of those places. Before we unlock the doors to one of the most unsettling mysteries in modern history, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It was the winter of 2013. A 21-year-old college student named Elisa Lamb had decided to take a solo trip along the west coast of the United States. She was from Vancouver, Canada, and she was looking for an adventure. Elisa was a bright, curious, and expressive young woman who documented her life heavily on the internet. She maintained a blog where she wrote about art, fashion, and her personal struggles. She was navigating the difficult transition into adulthood and wanted to see the world on her own terms. Her trip brought her down to Southern California, and she needed an affordable place to stay in the heart of Los Angeles. She found a hostel called Stay on Main. What Elisa likely did not realize was that Stay on Main was simply a rebranded section of the infamous Cecil Hotel. Built in the 1920s, the Cecil was originally designed to be a luxurious destination for wealthy travelers and businessmen. But when the Great Depression hit, the hotel fell on incredibly hard times. The surrounding area, known as Skid Row, became heavily populated by the transient, the desperate, and the forgotten. The Cecil slowly transformed into a cheap, long-term boarding house. Over the decades, it earned a deeply sinister reputation. It became a magnet for tragedy, serving as the final residence for numerous people who chose to end their lives. It was the temporary home to infamous serial killers who walked through the ornate lobby with blood on their hands, unnoticed by the staff. The building was a massive, towering monument to human suffering, holding nearly 700 rooms connected by a labyrinth of confusing hallways, dead ends, and dimly lit corridors. Elisa checked into the hotel on January 26th. Initially, she was placed in a hostel-style room with several other young female travelers. But within a few days, her roommates went to the front desk and complained about her behavior. They said she was acting erratically, leaving passive-aggressive notes on their beds and locking them out of the room. The hotel staff decided to move Elisa into her own private room on one of the higher floors. Elisa was very close with her parents back in Canada. She called them every single day of her trip to check in and let them know she was safe. But on January 31st, the day she was scheduled to check out of the Cecil Hotel and travel to her next destination, the phone call never came. Her parents waited. They called her cell phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. By the next morning, panic had completely set in. They contacted the Los Angeles Police Department and reported their daughter missing. Because the area surrounding the hotel was notoriously dangerous, the police took the report very seriously. They dispatched officers to the Cecil Hotel to conduct a search. They knocked on the door of Elisa's private room. There was no answer. When they used a master key to enter, they found a scene that made absolutely no sense. All of Elisa's belongings were still in the room. Her luggage, her clothes, her laptop, and most importantly, her medication were all sitting there. It looked as though she had just stepped out for a moment to grab a cup of coffee and intended to return immediately, but she was gone. The police began a massive search of the massive, confusing building. They walked down every hallway. They knocked on doors. They brought in specialized search dogs to sniff the corridors. The dogs tracked her scent through the hallways, up to a certain window, and then the scent completely vanished. The police even checked the roof of the hotel. They found that the heavy metal doors leading to the roof were securely locked and heavily alarmed. If anyone tried to open those doors, a loud siren would immediately sound at the front desk. The alarms had not been tripped. There was no trace of Elisa Lam. 2 weeks passed. The story of the missing Canadian tourist hit the local news, but the police had zero leads. It was as if the sprawling, dark hotel had simply opened its jaws and swallowed her whole. Then, in a desperate attempt to gather information from the public, the police released a piece of security camera footage captured inside one of the hotel elevators. They hoped someone might recognize her or notice a clue they had missed. Instead, the video became a viral sensation of pure, unadulterated terror. The footage is deeply unsettling to watch. It is silent, grainy, and stamped with the date February 1st. It shows Elisa walking into the elevator. She is wearing a red zippered hoodie, a casual shirt, and dark shorts. She steps inside, casually leans forward, and presses a column of buttons. She does not press just one button. She presses a series of them, right down the middle row. She steps back and waits for the heavy metal doors to close. But the doors do not move. They stay completely open. Elisa steps forward and looks out into the hallway. Her movements are sharp, jerky, and deeply strange. She peers out to the left, then to the right, moving her head with a bird-like paranoia. She suddenly jumps back into the elevator and presses herself flat against the wall, hiding in the corner as if she is terrified that someone or something is coming down the hallway to get her. A few moments pass. The doors still refuse to close. She steps out into the hallway again. This time, she does a strange, square dance-like step. She steps out, steps back in, steps out again. She is looking at something, but the camera angle only captures the interior of the elevator and a small sliver of the hallway. Whatever she is looking at is just out of frame. She walks out into the hallway, standing just to the left of the open elevator doors. Then, she begins to move her hands and arms in a bizarre, unnatural way. She twists her wrists, waving her fingers in the air as if she is treading water or casting a spell. Her hands contort and bend. She is clearly interacting with someone or something, but she is completely alone. Finally, she turns and walks away, disappearing down the dark hallway. The moment she is out of sight, the elevator doors finally, quietly, slide shut. The release of the video sent the public into a frenzy. Millions of people watched it, offering countless theories. Some believed she was being pursued by a killer who was standing just outside the camera's view, holding the elevator button to keep the doors open. Others pointed to the dark history of the Cecil Hotel, suggesting she was interacting with a sinister, invisible entity. Her unnatural hand movements and sheer terror seemed to defy any logical explanation. While the internet analyzed every single frame of the tape, a completely separate and horrifying situation was unfolding inside the hotel. Guests staying at the Cecil began calling the front desk with highly disturbing complaints. They said the water pressure in their rooms had dropped to a mere trickle. When they tried to take a shower, the water that came out of the showerhead was completely black. It looked like dark, muddy sludge. As the water ran, the color would eventually clear up, but the smell remained. The guests complained that the tap water smelled pungent, sweet, and metallic. When they brushed their teeth or drank from the sink, the water tasted putrid and completely foul. The complaints grew so numerous that the hotel management could no longer ignore them. On the morning of February 19th, a hotel maintenance worker was dispatched to investigate the plumbing. He took the elevator up to the top floor and used a secure stairwell to access the roof of the building. The roof of the Cecil Hotel was a vast, flat expanse of concrete and gravel. Sitting on top of a raised platform were 4 massive cylindrical water tanks. These tanks supplied the water for the guest rooms, the showers, and the kitchens below. They were huge metal structures, standing over 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide. The maintenance worker climbed a metal ladder to the top of the platform. He walked over to the first tank. He reached down and unlatched the heavy metal hatch that covered the opening at the top of the tank. He lifted the heavy lid, leaned forward, and looked inside the dark, echoing chamber. Floating face up in the water, inches from the top of the tank, was the decaying, naked body of Elisa Lamb. The worker scrambled backward in absolute horror. He immediately called the authorities. When the police and fire department arrived, the sheer logistics of the scene completely baffled them. The opening of the tank was so small, and the body was so swollen from being submerged in water for nearly 3 weeks, that they had to physically cut a hole in the side of the massive metal tank to drain the water and retrieve her remains. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves across the world. The guests inside the hotel realized with absolute terror that for the past 19 days they had been bathing in, brushing their teeth with, and drinking the water that contained a decomposing human body. But the horror of the discovery was quickly overshadowed by the impossible mystery of how she got there. The police had checked the roof during their initial search, and the doors were locked and alarmed. To get to the roof without triggering the siren, someone would have had to navigate a complex labyrinth of fire escapes on the exterior of the building, climbing up several stories in the pitch-black night. Furthermore, The water tanks were towering structures. There was no fixed ladder leading from the concrete roof to the top of the specific tank where she was found. To look inside, you had to climb onto a platform, then haul yourself up the slippery, curved metal side of the tank. Once at the top, you had to lift a heavy metal hatch. Inside the tank, police found the red hoodie, the shirt, and the shorts Elisa had been wearing in the elevator video. They were floating in the water alongside her. The public immediately suspected murder. It seemed physically impossible for a petite young woman to navigate the fire escapes, scale an 8-foot water tank, open a heavy metal lid, strip off her clothes, jump into the water, and somehow close the heavy lid behind her. It seemed obvious that someone had chased her down the hallway, murdered her, carried her to the roof, and dumped her body into the tank to hide the evidence. The medical examiner took weeks to conduct a thorough autopsy and toxicology report. When the results were finally released, they provided an explanation that was far more tragic and realistically terrifying than any ghost story or murder plot. The autopsy revealed zero evidence of physical trauma. There were no bruises, no broken bones, no signs of a struggle, and no defensive wounds. Furthermore, the toxicology report came back completely clean. There were no illegal drugs or alcohol in her system. However, the toxicology report did reveal something incredibly important. The levels of her prescribed medication in her bloodstream were extremely low. Elisa Lam suffered from severe bipolar disorder. Her condition required strict daily medication to keep her brain chemistry balanced. When she traveled to Los Angeles, the change in routine, the stress of traveling alone, or perhaps a personal decision, led her to stop taking her medication as prescribed. When a person with severe bipolar disorder stops taking their medication, they can fall into a deep, psychotic, manic episode. During these episodes, the brain begins to misfire. The person can experience vivid hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and a complete break from reality. They might believe they are being hunted. They might believe they have to hide. The haunting elevator video was not a recording of a woman interacting with a ghost or a killer. It was a tragic recording of a young woman trapped inside a terrifying hallucination created by her own mind. The reason the elevator doors did not close was not due to an invisible presence. In her frantic button pressing, she had hit the door hold button, which forces the elevator to stay open for 2 minutes. She was waving her hands and talking to a threat that felt entirely real to her, but existed only in her fractured consciousness. In a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror, she fled the elevator. She navigated the confusing hallways of the Cecil Hotel. She found an open window or a fire escape door that bypassed the roof alarms. Driven by the intense delusion that she needed to hide from her unseen pursuers, she climbed the exterior of the building. She scaled the water tank. She opened the heavy lid and climbed into the water, seeking the ultimate hiding spot. Once she was inside the tank, the water was freezing cold. Hypothermia sets in very quickly in dark, cold water. As the body core temperature drops dangerously low, people often experience a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. The brain becomes so confused by the cold that it suddenly registers extreme burning heat, causing the victim to frantically strip off their clothes in a desperate attempt to cool down. She removed her clothes. But the most terrifying realization of all was the water level. When she entered the tank, it was likely over half full. But the tank was essentially a giant metal barrel with smooth, slippery walls. There was no ladder on the inside. As the morning approached and the hotel guests woke up, they began to turn on their sinks and take their showers. As they used the water level inside the tank slowly began to drop. Elisa would have been treading water in the pitch-black darkness, shivering uncontrollably. As the water level sank lower and lower, the opening at the top of the tank moved further and further out of her reach. Her fingers would have scraped desperately against the slick metal walls, finding absolutely nothing to hold on to. She was trapped in an echoing, freezing, dark metal cylinder, screaming for help that would never come, until sheer exhaustion finally pulled her beneath the surface. The lid on top of the tank was likely never closed behind her. The initial reports of the maintenance worker finding the lid closed were corrected during the investigation. He had found the lid open exactly as she had left it when she climbed inside. The story of the Cecil Hotel and Elisa Lam leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a profound tragedy that strips away the comforting myths of monsters and ghosts, replacing them with the raw, devastating reality of mental illness. It teaches us a subtle, vital lesson about the immense vulnerability of the human condition. A person can be completely surrounded by hundreds of people in a massive hotel located in the middle of one of the most populated cities on Earth and still be entirely, hopelessly alone. It reminds us that the darkest, most terrifying places are not always found in the basements of old buildings or at the end of unlit hallways. Sometimes, the most inescapable prisons are built inside our own minds, waiting quietly for a moment of imbalance to lock the doors. Life requires us to be truly observant, to look past the surface of those around us, because we never know the terrifying battles someone might be fighting in the quiet isolation of their own reality. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an experienced hiker who went out for a short walk in a popular national park only to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of bizarre clues that made even seasoned search and rescue experts question the laws of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there.